Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. Hey, welcome back. Episode 14, Hard Knock Life, the reality of PBIS. This is actually came to us from somebody that listens to us. They were talking about the idea of how does trauma-informed care and all of that, how does that mesh with PBIS? And so we thought that'd be a great topic and something that's so important, I think, for us to be able to talk about.
Yeah, I think as we took on the work in our building, I think that was a common question or misconception. Well, what about What about all the PBIS stuff we're doing? Is that just gone all of a sudden? Sure. So I think it's good. I think it's a good conversation to have right now. And where does this all fall into place?
Yeah. So that's what we'll be chatting about today. We know a lot of people have put a ton of work in to PBIS, a lot of time, a lot of hours, and a lot of real intentional work has been put into that. And I think here at the front end, before we even start, I think it's important for people to know that work's we're not just shoving that work aside, and we're not saying that work wasn't valuable, right? But I think it is important for us to hear how this kind of connects and how they intermingle and how they can work going forward, right?
Yeah, how they're compatible.
Yeah.
Save your acronyms. We're going to use them.
Yeah, don't throw it all out.
Don't throw it out.
All right, so what is PBIS? Let's start there, and why does it exist?
Are you wanting me to?
Yeah, this is me asking you. If you want to start reading the questions first, then I have to answer. But if I read the questions first, you're the
I got it. Okay. So this is from PBIS.org. So that's legit site, right? So it's the tiered framework approach.
I hope that's a legit site.
It says .org. It's tiered framework support that encompasses behavior, academic, social, emotional, and mental health is what it's designed to do. It emphasizes 5 interrelated elements: equity. So you hear that repeated again in trauma-informed care. Systems, data, practices, and outcomes. And educators and practitioners provide continuum of academic, behavioral, social, emotional support matched with students' needs. We describe the continuum across the 3 tiers of support. So you're going to start seeing this recognized as really the SEL behavior side of RTI, or what now we're calling, you'll hear us talk about MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports all the time. This is really the tier 1 approach. And then it's being responsive to the tier 1 approach, and then hitting the tier 2 with some interventions, and then the tier 3 approach. But then getting into maybe why it exists. Sure. So why it exists is it comes out of restraint and seclusion law. So I think this is probably the biggest unknown or misconception from people. Restraint and seclusion law created PBIS because it's a response to we're not going to put kids in mechanical restraints or put them in safe spaces or restrain them anymore. Well, now what? The response is positive behavior intervention supports. It's the PBIS model. So
hit it ahead of time, right? It was to be, again, preventative.
Yeah, proactive.
Yeah.
Proactive. So this came out of the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, December of 2016. So you start thinking about some of the work that you're doing from a Dear Colleague letter. The Department of Ed basically says that imposed on the use of restraint and seclusion by public elementary school districts. In particular, this guidance informs school districts on how to use restraint and seclusion may result in discrimination against students and disabilities, and therefore violating Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Americans with Disability Act. So you hear us talk a lot about equity on the podcast. You also hear us talk about why minority groups and students with special needs are it's a response to that overuse of restraint and seclusion within those subgroups. Yeah. So this is from the Ohio Department of Ed, or the State Department of Ed. So this is federal. Every school district is required to follow a PBIS model and have training and have a system in place. And it's a foundation of MTSS moving forward. So it's all connected back to restraint and seclusion law, which I think was a big aha when I learned that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we were just being schools were being punitive, right?
Yeah.
They were being so punitive historically, and because of that, they had to come up with something different, right? Let's come up with something different that's better, that's preventative, that's proactive, that is positive, right, to use their language. And so here we find ourselves. And so there's a lot of good in there. I think that's one of the things, again, we've already said it once, but I think there's value in saying it again. What is some of the good stuff? What are some of the good things that come along with PBIS? We know now it exists. We know what it is. What are the good aspects of it? And and how does PBIS support student behavior?
Yeah, I think one thing that we had again and again and again in our building is that those clear expectations before you start every class, coming up with a community of what does our community need to look like, what are our expectations in our classroom. And before you start any lesson or your day, you should start with, here are the expectations. What do you guys think the expectations need to be? What are we all as a community agreeing on? So PBS is very clear about having expectations set within your classroom so kids know ahead of time. And a lot of them, and it's that teach, reteach, model, repeat, right? Cycle that we're always in with student behavior. And so I think that's a real positive to get people to be really mindful and upfront about that. PBIS, the big part of it is the data collection, which is probably an area that schools are terrible at. How do you collect data on PBIS and behavioral reporting? But we should be using the idea with PBIS is to collect behavior, positive or negative data, bring it back to your school-wide PBIS team, which you're required to have. And that team should be using data to help inform decisions about, do we need to make adjustments in the cafe? Is there, issues at the playground that we need to address or be proactive about, right? That team should be a proactive system based upon data. So I think that's great. It puts interventions in place for behavior and SEL. So you're looking at your tier 2 kids, that 15%, and that tier 3, those 5% of kids. It's requiring you to put interventions in place so that we're giving those interventions an experience instead of just being like, punitive, right? It's too bad. Good luck, right? Documentation and accountability it provides, and alternative to what we're currently being done. So I think those are all really strong positive highlights of PBIS and things that should be implemented in your school district.
Yeah, I think those 5 pillars that you talked about, even at the very beginning there, equity, systems, data, practices, and outcomes, right? Like those are all good things. Like none of those are things that we're like, but that doesn't match up with trauma-informed care. We don't care about. Like that system doesn't care about data or equity or whatever it might be. Like there's a lot of good stuff there. I think it's important to know too that PBIS isn't the same as an organization that they were 15 years ago. They've been changing and updating, and as just we've learned more, PBIS as an organization or as an entity, I guess, they continue to shift too and make adjustments. As one would expect, right? But I think what has happened a lot of times is people had been trained 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Or 20 years, or whatever it might be, right? And so they're operating off of what maybe PBIS looked like 15 years ago, which is very different than what it looks like now. And some of that training is very different now. But we already got trained. We already have people that have been doing it I've been doing PBIS at our school for 12 years, and this is what we've always done. Okay, well, now if you went back and actually looked and dove into what PBIS says, they say it's a lot different now than what it was when you got trained, 13 years ago, or whatever it might be. But they're shifting and they're changing too. And I think if you hear this, it may be worth, if you're one of those people that's like, oh, I got trained, but it was like 10 years ago, go back. Like dive into it a little bit more. Look for another training like in your area, because I think you'll find that stuff has shifted and changed in some ways. There's a lot that's probably still similar or the same, but I think you'd find that there's a lot that's a little bit different too. But going back to those 5 things, like data again was the key one for me. Does the data show that the systems we put in place are actually working? Are the things that we're doing, are the outcomes actually measurable, or are we doing things because we think they work? Are we doing things because it kind of seems like they work?
Feels good.
Yeah. And most of the kids it works for. But PBIS doesn't say like it should work for most of the kids, right? Like they're not, that's not their thing. They're like, well, we exist so that 80% of the kids are cool.
Yeah.
That's not what they say. But I think sometimes we still, as schools, I see a lot of schools, I guess I should say. I see a lot of schools that probably land there when I was seeing a lot more districts and a lot more schools individually. I think I saw that a lot. Where that's kind of how it was. It was like, well, we do these things. Everybody's got, not to knock this. I'm not knocking this. Don't hear this. Don't read this as like a critique. But like pretty much every elementary school, if you look at that, right, has
an acronym.
Everybody's passing out a ticket. Everybody's passing out something, whatever it is, some kind of, I hate to say trinkety thing, but some kind of like small prize kind of thing. Everybody's doing those things. But again, we all were told, for lack of a better term, you have to have some kind of PBIS system.
Yeah.
In place. There is no choice, which again was a response to awful things that were happening, and it was that's okay. It's okay that's why it became a thing. But I think if we're only doing like that, not bare minimum, but if we're only doing that initial part and checking it off as a box, then we're not even doing PBIS right.
Yeah.
Really.
It should be a consistent continuum. You should be meeting with that team once a month, using data to inform, reflecting on your practices, updating your system. If you have the same system you did when you started PBIS, you probably need to rally that team back together and really make some adjustments. We've no more. Things have changed. That the same system can't possibly be working. That you're not that. I can't imagine any school being that solid where the thing you started 10 years ago is really just consistently good still.
Well, and I think too, we're on, the backside of a global pandemic, right? And everybody's pretty quick to talk about how kids have changed. We really know that, humans as a whole have not changed. We know that what's really happened is that society has kind of shifted and changed and things got accelerated. We talked about this before. Don't need to belabor that point. But things are so different than they were 5 years ago. And so now we really every school should be reevaluating what we're doing on the backside of being in this kind of pandemic area. So again, a lot of times summer is this episode's initially coming out in the summer. A lot of times summer is when some of these things get talked about as schools and as districts. It may be worth, if you hear this, if you're listening in on this episode, and you're a part of one of those teams, or even if you're not a part of one of those teams, it may be worth bringing it up, to your school, to your district, whatever, and saying, hey, when was the last time we did kind of take a look at what we are doing for PBIS? I think that's a valuable time to do that.
Yep.
All right. So what are some of the flaws, hiccups, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, I think this is probably where we're going to spend the bulk of our conversation, right? Because
bashing PBIS?
No.
Is that what it? No, that's not it. Okay.
No, that's not it.
That's
but
good.
I think there are some hiccups with it, right? PBIS works for, you look at the tier process at tier 1. People always say with trauma-informed care, what about the other kids? Guess what? Yes. PBIS is a system that should be working for all the kids. So we're talking about this very small niche group of our kids that we talk a lot about on the podcast, that 5% or less in your building, those high needs kids. Sometimes we go crazy on PBIS for those 5% of kids, and PBIS does not work for those kids, right? And here's why. So there's a great quote. I'm going to talk about Alfie Cohen's work a lot, so maybe Josh can pop his book up on the video or something to help everybody. But I'm going to reference him a lot. He has a great book called Punished by Rewards.
Josh says no. No. He says he can't do it. No, wait. He said yes.
Yeah, okay. So here's a quote by him. It says, do rewards motivate people? Absolutely. They motivate people to get rewards. And here's just a little story. So I have a 7-year-old daughter who's at camp right now, and the camp is fantastic. They were doing kind of a PBIS model, doing shout outs for like good deeds that the kids are doing. She came home. She's like, I did 3 or 4 good deeds and I never got a shout out today. And I said, well, why are you doing the good deeds? Because I want a shout out. Completely. And she's 7, right? So completely motivated by the thing, not by the act. And
sure.
I told her, I was telling you the story off camera, but I said, you better dig deep, because you shouldn't be doing those things for the paper ticket. You should be doing it because it feels good and you're doing the right thing by people. I said, you really need to switch your motivation. And she did. I mean, she's done so much better, and she has gotten shout out since then. But she was so stuck on, I want that paper ticket and someone to recognize me for a public way to go, and wasn't really motivated by the good deed and act. So perfect example just in my own house of how that kind of works. But yeah, I just talked again about like 95% of the kids PBIS works great for. That 5%, this is the tricky part. And if you're into Ross Green's work, he'll say if only sticker charts really worked, right?
Sure.
That those external intrinsic motivations, that was really the shift. And how far different we would be as a society if we would have it all fixed in kindergarten, right?
Yeah, they would have figured it out already.
They would have figured it out, right? That's probably not it. But really that sense, we really need to go back to that sense of community and accountability within our like kind of the idea of restorative practices, where we kind of rally around kids and support them, that our community is supporting the kids, that they're not individually striving for that motivation or that reinforcer for the external thing, because that's not really establishing or building a community. We really have to go back to that community approach, and that's really what our kids in trauma really need, that sense of belonging, that sense of family, that sense of care, that love, the compassion to surround each other. And I think that's where maybe PBS is you have to add something extra onto PBIS, the trauma-informed approach with that. And it's really just ultimately not just about student behavior. It's really about adult behavior, because we're talking a lot about kids and the tier process, all that. PBIS doesn't address the adult, the educator state of mind, which we know this work ultimately is the work of adults and our mindset shift. So I think that's going to be a shift as we talk about like the trauma-informed piece coming in. It's really, we've got to address the adults. Just another quote by Alfie Cohen that I really liked was like, children learn how to make good decisions by making good decisions and not by following directions. So empowering kids to really have ownership and choice, and really be internally motivated and doing it for the greater good of the community and not the greater good of me.
Yeah, sure.
So,
I think that if you've done much work with PBIS at all, like you've seen the pyramid, right? That has that the majority of the base, right? That 80% kind of being that tier 1. But then everybody gets what those tier 1 supports are, but about 80% of the kids only need that, right? They don't need the extra. And then you've got that middle ground, like 15%, and then ultimately that 5% at the top that you kind of were talking about in that third tier. And I think that what most schools are good at doing is some tier 1 thing, right? Like, but they struggle maybe to know what to do beyond that. It's not that it's bad. It's not like that setup is bad. I think that schools just struggle to know what to do. And there's a lot of legwork. If you've done the work, like to set up PBIS systems at a school, it's a ton of work to like even get to just getting that tier 1 that everyone gets. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort from people that are usually working probably without getting paid extra or maybe getting paid very minimally extra. It takes a lot of time to put something together and to build a system that a whole school is going to use and then to roll it all out and then everything else. I think and this is just purely anecdotal, I guess, from what I've seen in life. I think I think schools get tired by the time they've done all of that. And I think it's really hard then to come up with what's actually much harder, which is the next 2 tiers.
Yeah. For the kids that probably consume more of our time. Less kids consume more of our time than the bottom 80%.
Yeah. And the bottom 80% probably would have been fine without a PBIS system in place.
Oh, yeah. They came to school.
Right? Like they were probably going to be okay anyway. Like just typically speaking. And so, but so much time has to be put forth to like create the system that I think people get tired. And then those next levels of systems, those tier 2, those tier 3 kids, those top 20%, that need all that extra help. I think like we are not particularly equipped. Most schools don't have many people, if any, sometimes that are particularly equipped to know how to work with those tough students.
Or have the data to support why this kid needs different. And then what does that system look like at our greater building for those kids? Yeah.
And so then what we do is now all of a sudden we're like several months into a school year and those top 5% or whatever it is, 2 to 5%, I think is what I usually hear. The 2 to 5% of kids end up getting brushed aside, right? That are like the most repeat offenders of whatever, that are having the hardest time and needing the most help. They ultimately end up getting brushed aside in some way, whether that's, suspension, whether that's, starting some process to get them into special education, whether that's, whatever it might be. They end up getting kind of brushed aside. I think one of the other flaws sometimes is whenever anything gets like kind of mandated, it becomes a checklist thing.
Yeah. We did that. Check.
Yeah, we have to do it.
We have to do
like
training for
telling
that.
Us we have to do it.
Yep.
So now we have to have, a committee for it. Now we have to like go through this process. And so it's not that that's bad. I think again, like intention behind it all being mandated is like, it's with good intention. But I think anytime stuff starts getting like you have to's, like all of a sudden there's a lot of problems with that because then people would just make it a checklist thing. And so they check the box. That's what you do in those situations. It's why, to be honest with you, it's why I'm always like slightly a little worried, like, with trauma-informed care and social emotional learning, all those things, like anytime somebody's like, now you have to do it, I get why that happens. I understand because a lot of schools or districts maybe aren't doing them at all and wouldn't do them unless it was mandated. I get all that. But it always gives me a little bit of pause every time like the next thing is mandated because I'm like, ooh, it's just lost a little bit of like the effectiveness, I think. We're going to lose a little bit of the effectiveness all of a sudden if it's something you have to do instead of something that you get people to buy into. and believe in just on their own, and then they start doing it. And again, I understand where it all comes from. I'm not saying that's bad. Just my own little particular rant on once we start saying something is mandated, right?
As a school administrator, I found the stuff exhausting. The trinket, like we got rid of my second year, all the trinkets.
Yeah.
I can't do the trinkets anymore.
It's a lot to
I
keep
don't want to
track
buy
of.
anymore. I don't, as a parent, I don't want the stuff coming home. It just, I don't know. I just had a really hard time with all the stuff. So really thinking about meaningful things. I do think we have things to put in place. We're switching over. We stole this from another school, but the like little swag tags, little charms to put, like the kids are collecting those just to kind of freshen it up. I know we're kind of like redid ours in our building,
Sure.
But really looking at like how can we provide better tier 1 supports, and then the tier 2 and tier 3 behavioral supports are more research based things that aren't so much PBIS driven, but they're systems and trauma-informed things that we know are great for kids. We're trying to put some different things in place that aren't things that are more community people-based.
Yeah, sure.
So,
okay, so how does PBIS kind of integrate with trauma-informed care then?
well, I think the goal for both are to support behavior reform and create alternatives to punitive discipline, right? So they are aligned very much in those ways, and you kind of need to have both systems in place. They're just different. So PBIS targets are core of our students who need systems, rules, boundaries, incentives, et cetera, right? So I think all kids, those are beneficial for all kids. But trauma-informed care really supports children holistically, and then it's looking at the children's neurological and biological needs based upon lived experiences. So just a different lens and views. PBIS is very extrinsic, and trauma-informed is very intrinsic in terms of how we view and look at kids.
Sure.
So, and I think just kind of goes back to that whole idea of like kids do well if they can. That, you know, school, I think Ross Green said, school discipline programs is not working for the kids who aren't doing well and is not needed for the kids that are.
Yeah. And that's kind of the hard thing with it, right? I don't think that PBIS is bad. Like I say all that, or it has to go away or anything like that. I just think that people really need trying and understanding like on how to work with and build relationships with the top 5 to 20% of the pyramid. Like they need to learn how to actually work with those kids and what works. And again, what works isn't a gimmick. And what works isn't like some system that if you just put this system in place. And I'm not saying that's what PBIS hangs its hat on. I think that but I do think like what you're saying, it's like a different way of seeing trauma-informed care really is. It's not because I've talked to people before that are like, oh, well, how is how are people implementing trauma-informed care? Like, what is the thing, like that system, trauma-informed care? And I'm like, well, it's not a system. It's like really a way of seeing
It's a belief about children. What are our beliefs about children? What do we know about humans?
Yeah. How can I see the people I'm working with? What do I take in? With my senses, and then what do I do with that internally in my mind, right? Like how am I now processing all of that information, and then what do I do with that differently because of what I know about how the brain works or about how trauma impacts people or whatever it might be. And so whereas PBIS is a little bit more of a system, I don't think PBIS would come back and say like, you're right, we don't care about that. Like that's not the case either, right? But like one's more of a system that it's asking somebody to create and put in place, and one's more of a way of seeing the world. And I think those two things can work together very well, actually. I think if people continue to get trained and get a depth of understanding into what trauma-informed care is, that's when that top 5 and 20%, like 20, 25% of kids in those second and third tiers, that's when we're going to have a much better understanding of what to do there, right? Like we can keep like the tier 1 stuff in place, but when people struggle, and they struggle so mightily with knowing what to do with those kids that are repeat kind of kids that are like the frequent flyers of having issues and who again, ultimately just need a lot of help, need the most help. We struggle to know what to do with them. And what we need to do with them ultimately is focusing on building relationships and trust and coming up with a way to make them feel safe and secure kind of at school. All of those things that we've talked about in any number of other episodes you can look at. But that's where I think these two things can actually pair together really well.
Yeah.
Right? is like the missing piece that so often is a struggle for people in that 5 to 20%. This is that missing piece, right? It's the professional development. It's the consistent training. It's having people in your district who know what they're doing with trauma-informed care come alongside people and form relationships with the other adults in the building. The very thing that we say we should be doing with kids, right? To help kids learn better from somebody they have a relationship with, so do adults, right? Yeah. So if we start coming alongside other adults and walking kind of a journey with them to teach about trauma-informed care, whether it's in a very official or a very non-official way, then all of a sudden we start seeing people make those minor shifts in their ways of thinking and seeing, and then how they're acting and reacting to kids, or being proactive with kids, really, which is what we want, right? And so then that is how we're going to solve that, like kind of 5 to 20%, those top parts of the pyramid. It's not going to be like a gimmicky way, and it's not going to be like a one size fits all kind of way for those kids, which again is what PBIS would say. Once you get up to that top 5%, it's not like then they do this one thing that we decided and that fixes it. They would say you need to like individualize and figure out with those kids like what the solution is. But I think we've run out of steam so much, and we don't know what to do. And so people, they kind of putter out by the time we get to the kids that in those top 2 parts of the pyramid. They don't know what to do. This pairs so well together, though. You need to know this to be able to help those top tier kids.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, folding in the restorative practice model at the
Yes.
tier 1 level, so restorative practices services at the tier 2 level, and it's certainly going to be serviced at the tier 3 level, so that would be a great thing to implement through your tier system. I think going back to using data, your team should be using data. Figure out how you're collecting data, where the data is coming from, because if not, you're just going by your gut feeling, which is subjective. And I think you're looking at that tier 3 approach, really looking at those trauma-informed FBAs and BIPs. So those functional behavior assessments and the behavior intervention plans, and not just a traditional one, really looking through that trauma-informed lens. I think that really helps really get to the core of the universal needs within children, looking at that trauma-informed piece to really put those right interventions in place, which is the heart of PBIS.
Yes,
putting those those experiences in place that were not punitive or being proactive. So I think those are just some practical things to just go back to your building and say, okay, I can fold these things in, and that's how I'm going to help support. I know we've kind of reformed our disciplinary system in a tiered approach. It took some time, but like the outputs for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and this is how we're going to approach and interventions we'll put in place for kids.
Sure. All right, so what do we want people to walk away knowing at the end of this episode?
I think it's important to keep the base, provide intervention, collect data, but ultimately larger outcomes need to be for kids to self-advocate for themselves. I think we can't just keep doing stuff to kids like good job, right?
Sure.
We need to get kids to start. We need to teach them how to self-advocate, understand themselves, and read social boundaries and consequences. There's no real life scenario where stickers get you through the day, right? Or there's no one at your work passing out like tickets. So we need to really start. Right. Yeah. So we really need to switch over and get it, teaching kids how to respond and feel their own body and what their needs are. If we could teach them that, then that's part of the intrinsic awareness or self-motivation. And so let's teach kids that struggle the most with those practical skills and really create more of a humanistic experience through the foundations of PBIS.
Yeah, I think maybe what I want people to walk away from knowing is really maybe speaking directly more to like the educators that have put so much work in with the PBIS stuff. You know, a lot of you guys out there have worked really, really hard to develop very intricate, elaborate PBIS systems for your school or your district that are great, right? And that's not wasted time, effort. I know I said this once already, but I think it bears repeating as we finish out. It's still valuable moving forward. Trauma-informed care isn't like a system to replace it. Again, it's not like another system that's going to knock out PBIS, but it's a way of seeing people around you and knowing how to better respond to them and to help them. And so trauma-informed care and PBIS can actually work really well together. I really think that's the missing piece sometimes with PBIS is those top 2 tiers. People just struggle so mightily knowing what to do to help those kids. And if we can understand why those kids are having the issue that they're having and having the struggle they're having, then that goes a long way in us solving the problem, right? A very Ross Green kind of thought process. I think we have to understand how brains work and how humans work and how trauma works and all of that to be able to do that. And so utilize these things together, right? look at revamping PBIS a little bit, but more than that, I would say focus in on those top 2 tiers. Because the tier 1, the other 80%, it's going to keep functioning however you had it set up.
They've got
Focus on those other 2 and figure out what you need to be trained on and what better understanding your school or your district needs, maybe in trauma-informed care and things like that, to be able to actually adequately help those kids in those top tiers.
So keep both things going.
Yeah.
They need to be compatible hand in hand.
Yeah.
That they're...
It's not one or the other.
Yeah. And so all the hard work is well worth it. And now we're just going to add on that other layer to support our kids that are in need the most.
Yeah, which I think is actually going to be a very welcome thing by a lot of teachers. If we can start figuring out those top 2 tiers, that's going to actually be a thing that a lot of us teachers out there are going to very much appreciate.
I think some would argue the tier is growing. The pyramid might be flipping upside down.
They might have to reevaluate those percentages, PBIS. I don't know who's keeping track of those, but... Well, thank you. Hopefully that gives you guys some insight into PBIS. Again, we're not saying we're like the PBIS experts or anything like that, but hopefully it gives you some insight into how we've kind of paired the 2 at school and in a school, and what you can maybe do moving forward. And hopefully it gives you a little bit of clarity knowing that people on like the trauma-informed care side shouldn't be saying get rid of PBIS, it's bad, or let's ignore that, or none of that was right. That's not the case. If people are saying that to you, they're I guess maybe they're wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, they're wrong, and it's actually illegal. You have to have a PBIS. So don't listen
keep that going. Don't listen to that.
Don't listen to them.
But hopefully it gives you a little bit of understanding how they maybe work together, and that they can work together, and that it's actually very important to have them work together. Like always, we really appreciate that you guys came and listened, that you joined us in this conversation. Ask us questions, email us, share it with people, especially this summer. Like, hopefully there's stuff that you found useful in our episodes so far. Share those with people. Help people find a way to hopefully learn without sitting in a professional development, right? This is hopefully an easy way for them to do that. And we just appreciate just your consistency with us. And we really appreciate, like always, you joining in that conversation. So now let's go out there and do the work.
Let's go do it.